Hi, greetings everybody. Aaron Pott here with Blackbird Vineyards. We have another exciting tasting today. We're going to go over a few concepts and ideas that we went over in our last virtual tastings. So those of you that were part of that, you will soon be super educated in the world of Blackbird wines. Today we have 4 wines that we're going to taste and some really fabulous things. So I'm excited to taste these 4 wines. They're all from a single vintage, and we'll discuss that. We'll discuss that a little later. But it's a great vintage and a really interesting vintage, I think, for Napa Valley. A little different than some of the other vintages we've looked at in the past. Just briefly, I want to get on to the history of Blackbird Vineyards and how we came about and who we are. And I think one of the most important things that started Blackbird was a dedication to unusual grape varietals. Blackbird comes from the name for Merlot, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about Merlot. But it was dedicated to this obscure variety, Merlot. And when a lot of people were just making Cabernet Sauvignon in Napa Valley, Blackbird decided to go in a right turn, a 90-degree right turn, and work with Merlot. And that really came because of a vineyard that our founder, Michael Polensky, found in southern Napa Valley in a little region called Oak Knoll. And that vineyard is the Blackbird Vineyard. And it was named Blackbird Vineyard before Michael bought it. The vineyard itself was planted in 1997 and yielded its first crop, funnily enough, in 1999. And that original wine made under the Celine label, and that's the label of excellent winemaker Mia Klein, who I was fortunate enough to follow as the consulting winemaker at Fisher Vineyards. Mia was the winemaker at Dalla Valle for quite a long time. Excellent vineyard in the upper reaches of Oakville, and also a fabulous maker of Cabernet Franc, in my opinion. The wines of Dalla Valle are unbelievably good. But anyway, Mia made an excellent wine from the Blackbird Vineyards in that first year, and it's very unusual that a vineyard produces in its second leaf, and it's very unusual that the vines are balanced enough in that second leaf to produce wines that are even drinkable. But she produced a phenomenal wine from that vineyard, and I think that really shows you how special the vineyard is. And that wine was really celebrated by all of the critics at the time, who fell in love with it, and it became kind of a legend. And Michael Polensky bought the vineyard in 2003. What am I saying? I'm going back in time. And started the Blackbird Vineyards label just with wines from that vineyard. And it grew to include a couple more vineyards. And then in 2007, I was hired to expand the project. And that expansion really focused on vineyards in the cooler climates of Napa Valley, and focused on Bordeaux varieties, but the Bordeaux varieties from what we call the right bank. And when you think of right bank and left bank, you often think of Paris, because there's the left bank of the Seine, which is where all the university the center of the university area is found, and that was the Latin Quarter, a wild area. And anyway, when we think of the right bank, we're thinking of the Gironde River in Bordeaux. And if you look in the direction that the river flows, the right bank will be on your right-hand side and the left bank will be on your left-hand side. The left bank is more familiar to people as the area of the Médoc, or the city of Bordeaux itself. And the Médoc is really the home of Cabernet Sauvignon. And we'll talk a great deal about that today as well. And to continue with the Blackbird story, I started looking at new vineyards and expanding the vineyards, and really looking at vineyards in cool climates, as I said. And in Napa Valley, when we talk about cool climates, we're talking about vineyards at altitude or vineyards in the southern part of the valley. So that's really because we have the fog that comes in from off of the bay, and the areas that are closest to the bay, those areas get the most benefit, cooling benefit from that fog, and are cooler in the summertime, in the spring, summer, fall. They can be more moderate in the winter and not as cold as some of the low-lying areas to the north. So it's that proximity to the sea that creates the cooling. So in Napa Valley, when you're further south, those are generally cooler vineyards. I will say that we had a period of great expansion at Blackbird Vineyards, and now we're having a period of contraction where we're really wanting to focus on the main wines that we produce. And those main wines are based on our three favorite Bordeaux varieties: Merlot under the Illustration label, Cabernet Franc under the Paramour label, and Cabernet Sauvignon under the Contrarian label. And we have also the Riviste Rosé, and I see that Tia Simon is having a little bit of that right now, which is good. We're all happy about that. It's a favorite of mine as well. And also the Dissonance, the Sauvignon Blanc coming out of the Hudson Vineyard in Carneros, and a few others. Always some special wines, and today we're just dealing with special wines, so it's kind of a fun day. So recently we were taken over by friends of mine, John and Julia Hinshaw, and they are doing wonderful things with Blackbird and miniaturizing it and focusing it on the best quality, the best of our vineyards. And I think it's a great moment to be Blackbird, to fly with Blackbirds. So hopefully we will all do that. So I want to talk a little bit about how Blackbird wines are made, because it's a little different than a lot of other wines. There's been a lot of technology being used in winemaking, especially in California. I think more than anywhere else in the world, we're using a lot of technology for good and for bad in winemaking in California. And I think there are good uses of technology that we are using at Blackbird, and foregoing the bad technology. When I talk about bad technology, I'm talking about technology that's unnatural. We try to use great sites, first of all. And that means sourcing from vineyards that are quality vineyards, preferably organic vineyards, vineyards that are owned by people that care, vineyards that are in sites that we want to be in, where both the soil and the climate match the type of wines we're going to make. There's often people that buy vineyards in Napa Valley. They buy vineyards and then they plant the grapes that they like. And that's a bad idea. We like to find sites where we or other people have planted grapes that go well with the site, that match the site. And that makes it easier to make great wine from those sites. And like I said, we want to find those sites that are as cool as possible in the Napa Valley, that are going to produce wines that are elegant, that are restrained, that are not super alcoholic, that we can drink preferably with food. And I'm very hungry right now, so you may hear my stomach growl during this, but I'm thinking about food. So in the last 2 years, we have built an amazing winemaking facility. And we took us about 1.5 years to put it all together, but it is in a very nondescript warehouse in southern Napa. And from the outside, you would think it could be anything. But from the inside, it is the most technologically superior winery that you could possibly imagine. We have everything that you need to make a great wine in this very small facility, and perfectly suited for our needs. We have wonderful tanks that were built by a fabulous producer, Le Jeune in Castillon, just outside of Bordeaux, that were assembled there and shipped out. And each one of those tanks has a automatic pump over device on it. So we can dial in exactly the extraction that we want to get by tasting every day and finding the exact extraction, instead of having someone go from tank to tank doing the same work on those tanks. We're looking at the extraction that we want and dialing in exactly the parameters we want to get the extraction that we want. Again, we have an amazing sorting system. So every grape that comes in to the Blackbird facility gets individually sorted. First, we sort through the clusters themselves. And this is after pretty severe sorting by the picking crew in the vineyard. After that, we're sorting each individual cluster as it goes up an incline table and taking out anything that's not a grape. Those grapes go into a destemmer crusher, but they're only being destemmed there. And then the grapes fall whole onto a massive, what's called a shaker table. The shaker table has holes underneath it that are smaller than a regular shaped grape. And that gets out all of the things that are tiny, that are not grapes, that are shot berries, what we call shot berries. Those are green grapes, and they fall underneath. Also raisins fall into that trap and are taken out. And that's an important thing for me. I'm a raisin hater when it comes to wine. And there are a lot of people in California that just make wine from raisins. So I am a raisin hater. Remember that. I hate raisins. They just don't make good wines. I'm sorry, unless you're wanting to make Amarone, which is a good wine. So after the shaker table, they go through an optical sorter, and the optical sorter essentially takes a photo of every berry and compares it to what is a perfect berry, and then uses air to shoot out anything that's not a berry, anything that's slightly imperfect, a little less than round. And we the winemakers can control those parameters in terms of color, shape, size, etc. And this automatic optical sorter will shoot out anything that we don't like. And then lastly, the wines go into bins, and those bins have people around them that sort through the grapes in those bins and do a final by eye sorting of the grapes before they are gently moved into tanks. The fermentations are generally all with indigenous yeast. There's no packaged yeast used. We use the natural yeast that comes in with the grapes from the vineyard, natural bacteria that comes in with the grapes from the vineyard. We really want to capture the flavor and the characteristics of those vineyards. I'm glad you hate raisins too. I see that on there. Somebody hates raisins too. Good. So we have nothing in the wines but grapes, and the fermentations last anywhere from 20 days to 50 days in tank, and then they're drained warm to barrel. So during that period, you know, the fermentations go rather quickly. They can be done with the when the wine has fermented through its sugar, the grape's sugar, then it is pretty much done. You know, the yeast are eating that sugar. They're essentially pooping out alcohol and CO2. Once that process is done, the fermentation's done, but we do what's called a maceration after that. And the maceration is a process where we're taking the austere and harsh tannins and combining them, creating a wine that's soft, that has richness to it. And once we are satisfied by tasting daily that we've reached a point where the wine is at its best, then we drain the tanks. And those wines go directly warm. They're at about 75 degrees Fahrenheit at this point. They go warm into barrels. I worked for many years in France and created many relationships with coopers in France. And we use a lot of those coopers that I created relationships with, Orion, Tannery Baron, Terenceau, Sylvain, and certainly Bossuet, who's one of my favorites. And Bossuet has a history in the right bank in Saint-Emilion-en-Pomerol, a great history. He was the house cooper at Petrus in Pomerol. And I was the first person to buy one of his barrels when he started producing barrels. And he is what's called a mérandier, which is a guy that goes out into the forest and finds the wood that will become staves to make barrels. So he has a really good understanding of the product from the tree to the barrel itself. I actually helped, working with him, helped him to develop a barrel that we use exclusively with Blackbird Vineyards and with clients of mine. So I'm very, very proud of that fact. So let's talk a little bit about blending. There's a lot of blending that goes on with Blackbird Vineyards. We have many different vineyards that we work with, and we keep those wines separate in barrel until the time that we put them together and that we bottle them. So we put them together just before bottling, and they stay, they're together for about a week, 2 weeks before they go directly to bottle. And the process to form those blends is a long process, and it's one that I particularly love and have a bit of a knack for, I think. And I was very lucky as a young winemaker to meet one of the greatest blenders of all time, a guy named Michel Rolland. And Michel was a consulting winemaker. He consults for 20 different countries for over 100 different producers, including a couple very well-known ones here. Harlan for one, Screaming Eagle for another. But Michel has been known for his ability to blend, and I was very lucky that Michel chose me to be the winemaker at a chateau called Trollon-Mondeau in Saint-Emilion, and brought me over to France as a 26-year-old young winemaker to run a Grand Cru Classé, now Premier Grand Cru Classé in France. And I was able to have sort of an open office door policy with Michel, and I took full advantage of that. I saw him as often as I possibly could, and learned as much as I possibly could from him. So I just saw that someone had sent a link to the map on the chat section, so people might want to look at that map, and I hope my wonderful assistant, the Fever, will put that up at some point in time when we're talking about the vineyards. So not always, yeah, there's our map. We will get to that. We will get to that soon. But so not always do the best wines make the best blends. Oftentimes it's wines that have something bizarre about them that make the best blends. So say a wine is very tannic. One would think that that wine, when blended with another wine, would make a wine that's very tannic, but often it's just the opposite. You can put together two wines that are extremely tannic, and they might make a wine that has the impression of being not tannic at all. So it's a lot of trial and error and a lot of fun. What we do at Blackbird is myself and Kyle Mizuno, the day-to-day winemaker at Blackbird, sit down and we taste through all the wines that we've produced in the year. And that may be over a couple of days because we might want to focus on just Merlot one day, just Cabernet Franc another day, just pressed wines one day, free run wines the next day. But then we see which wines go together over the 2 years, almost to 2 years that the wines are part of our lives before they go into bottle. And we see which wines go together, and those wines eventually come together in the blends. And the blends that we do first are generally the smallest and most interesting blends. So that's what we're looking at today, are some of these super interesting wines. These wines we're looking at today, 3 of the wines are what we call the BlackMail wines. And this is a category of wine that we started that we may be moving away from. There may be just one BlackMail wine in the future. There may be no BlackMail wines in the future, but in 2015, we made 3 BlackMail wines, and they were Merlot based, Cabernet Franc based, and Cabernet Sauvignon based. And the real difference between these and the Illustration, which is Merlot based, the Paramour, which is Cabernet Franc based, and the Contrarian, which is Cabernet Sauvignon based, is that these were real dominant blends of those varietals. So whereas Illustration may be as much as 60% Merlot, the BlackMail is over 90% Merlot. So they're very, very intense blends. of their single variety. And they are fabulous, fabulous wines. So let's talk a little bit about the vintage, since we're tasting one vintage. And this is one of the weirder vintages. We've had a great decade. If you look at the decade from 2010 to 2019, we've had an incredible string of amazing vintages. 2010, unbelievable vintage. It wasn't thought of as a great vintage when the wines first came out, but as the wines age, people are really starting to think that they're fabulous wines. 2011, very difficult vintage. Rain during the harvest, very complex vintage, but even those wines made by the right people and from the right sites are producing wonderful wines. 2012, great vintage. 13, fabulous vintage, one of the greats of all time, I think. 14, great vintage. 15, we'll talk about at great length. 16, fabulous vintage, one of the greats as well. 17, more difficult vintage. 18 and 19, fabulous vintages. So you look at, there's nothing there. If you think that in a place like Bordeaux, you get one great vintage in 10, and we've had about 9 vintages in 10 that are unbelievably good. It's really been a fabulous run, and really, I think it's a decade that has seen a real rise in the quality of Napa Valley wines and made us one of the greatest wine regions in the world. And I don't say that lightly. So getting back to 2015, very odd vintage. 3rd year of major drought for us. It took almost until 2017 for that drought to come to a close. Very, very dry vintage. Very warm spring. We had an super early bud break. Long flowering during a cold spell that made ripening very uneven. And I think it's that ripening, or that flowering period, that is probably the most defining thing about the vintage. It was a very cool flowering period, and the cooler it is, the longer it takes for the flower to turn into fruit. And when you have conditions like that, you get a lot of unevenness, not just on between vines, but between clusters and between berries on those clusters. So that flowering sort of set the course for a difficult year. It also put us a little bit behind. We had started with an early bud break, and that cold spell really put us behind. We had a heat wave that started on the 8th of June, and this was after this incredible cold spell, in which we had a little rain as well. And then the vines caught up from flowering to Vera Zone. And Vera Zone, I mean, the direct translation of the word is towards reason, which I think is wonderful. But Vera Zone is the period when the grapes change color. Green grapes that are white varieties turn golden and soften up. Red varieties turn purple and soften up as well. So the skins soften. It's really the key moment after that, between Vera Zone and harvest, that you have the weather has to be ideal. What we found out at Vera Zone in that vintage was that we had a lot of uneven ripening, terrible uneven ripening, and you had vines on the same vines had clusters on them that were both green and had changed color, and they were weeks apart. And so in almost all of the vineyards, we made the decision to go in and drop fruit. Already we had lost a great deal of fruit from early frost, from that cold spell during the flowering. We had very poor flowering. So already the crop was very low, and then boom, we have to drop more fruit. So yields were about a third less than normal yields in good vineyards. So successive heat waves in September created raisoning everywhere, and really need to be protected by the leaves on the plant. And I think if you taste the wines around Napa Valley, the mountains fared the best. And the wines themselves, they were surprisingly, they didn't have a lot of tannin in them. They were not very tannic at all. They were very rich because they had very little, there was very little fruit on the vine. So the yields were tiny, and they became very rich wines, but they didn't have a lot of tannin structure to them. So the structure of the wines was unusual in that they were soft, they were very approachable as young wines, but didn't have a great deal of structure to them. There was some fear that the wines might not age well, but they've aged very well. And that's really because of that concentration. I think if we had made the decision not to drop fruit, we would have been in trouble. I see that Tia Simon says that she loves the 2011 vintage. I love that. Yes, I like the 2011 vintage too. The wines made in great vineyards by winemakers that had experience working in harsh climates like Bordeaux are very good. I have two friends, a Frenchman and a Swiss guy, Philippe Melka and Jean Hofflinger, and I try their wines from 2011. They're fabulous. I think anybody that has experience making wines in harsh vintages had made great wines in 2011. But anyway, we're talking about 2015. So let's start with one of these BlackMail wines. And I think the best place to start is with the Merlot. So I'm going to open this guy. Very pretty label. You can see we've got more birds than usual in the BlackMail. And I like, there's a little quote on the back, and I don't know who it's from, but it says, the wine is credible, not contrived. And I think that's a very good quote. So this is a 4-barrel blend. So it's less than 100 cases of wine. So, and selected from 4 barrels. If I can get this top off. Pull the cork here and see what we have. So again, I was saying that Blackbird derives its name from Merlot, and it's an interesting story. I mean, I'm a little hesitant. A lot of people say Merlot comes from the French word for little blackbird. I see somebody back there. For little blackbird, and little blackbirds. The word for blackbird in French is merle, M-E-R-L-E. But there was a moment in France when there were 2 languages spoken in northern France. Well, a language spoken in northern France and a language spoken in southern France. At the time, southern France was called Aquitania. And it's still, the name Aquitania still exists in the name for the region, the Languedoc, long meaning language, and D apostrophe OC, meaning the language of Oc. Oc was the word for yes in Occitan, and that language has become Catalan now. But the word for, or the name of the blackbird in Occitan was Merlot, Merlau, and so my hypothesis is that the word Merlot comes from the Occitan word for blackbird, and Bordeaux would have been in Occitan, and so a lot of people would have called a blackbird a Merlot rather than a Merle, which is what they would have called it north of the Gironde River, or north of Auvergne in what was called the Languedoc, and Oi became oui, or the language of oui, which is French. So the first mention of Merlot, and this supports my tiny theory, the first mention of Merlot is written mention is in 1783, and it says, bear with me, Merlot fait un vin noir et excellent, et il abonde dans un bon terroir. So this means Merlot makes an excellent dark black wine, and it is abundant and it grows abundantly in a good soil or good site, and so that Merlot is spelled M-E-R-L-A-U and not M-E-R-L-O-T like we know it. So, I mean, that further makes me think that the origin is Occitan and not French. Close enough. So, as you know, Merlot is a natural cross between two varieties, Cabernet Franc, the father also of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and an obscure variety called Madeleine Noir de Charente. And weird coincidence, but Madeleine Noir de Charente, which is almost non-existent to this day. I mean, they had to like go around and find this thing in some obscure vineyard, and I think they actually only found five vines of it, but the DNA research supported this. And this is also the mother of Malbec. So another variety not only celebrated in the region of Bordeaux, but also an important variety in the region of Cahors, Gascony, which would have been in medieval times a very important grape. So let's get back to this guy. We're going to taste it. Why not? In my very manky glass, I have these fabulous glasses. We use these for tasting at Seven Stones Winery, another one of my winemaking clients, Seven Stones Winery in St. Helena. And these are Zalto glasses, and every time the Zalto glasses become stained, and they stain eventually with wine, the general manager at Seven Stones gives them to me. So I get these fabulous glasses for nothing, although I have to live with the stains on them. So cheers, you guys. Oh, wow. Yeah, this is, I mean, classic Merlot. And when you think of the aromas of Merlot, I think the first thing that everybody thinks of is cherry. And probably the second thing that everyone thinks of is cocoa. They're kind of the classic tells for Merlot, that really ripe wild cherry. It always kind of reminds me of a wild cherry lifesaver when I was a kid, but it's that real bright cherry, and that what we always called wild cherry. And this really has a lot of that cherry, a lot of that the fruity aroma of an iris. If you smell irises like I do every time I see an iris, and I'm not talking about those ones you get in a florist that have never probably seen the outside world, but the ones that you see growing in the countryside. And you stick your nose in between the petals there, and there is the most amazing aroma, and it's really something to see. And Merlot it always has this wonderful iris character. I think we've got a little bit of cedar and cigar box, and then this marvelous kind of, I love this forest floor, this mushroom. It's a little porcini mushroom aroma. Wonderfully earthy, and I love that complexity that Merlot gets, where it can go from being, you know, very fruity, being very chocolatey, kind of German chocolate cake, even with the coconut character coming from the barrels, and those warm baking spices, and then just that marvelous floral character, and then the earthiness, that's where the complexity lies with Merlot. And I think if we think about Merlot, it is one of the great grapes of all time. I mean, some of the most wonderful wines are made from Merlot. And a lot of people might say, oh, that Aaron, he probably wears pink satin underpants because he loves Merlot. But Merlot is a very serious, wonderful grape, and I am a huge fan. Mm. Holy moly, that is massive. I mean, massive and soft. It's having a little dance on my tongue, but so much. I mean, just the cocoa and the cherry in them on the mouth, tobacco, real rich character. This wine, it comes from one vineyard, which is funny because a lot of these wines are combinations of things, but it's two different varietals, and there's a tiny amount of Cabernet Franc. I can't even remember the quantity of Cabernet Franc that we put in here, but it wasn't much. But they all come from a vineyard called Scheldt Vineyards. And for those of you that know the valley well, Scheldt Vineyards is in just southwest of the town of Yountville. And they make their own wines, make some wonderful wines. Winemaker Will Segui, who married into the Scheldt family, and is a great winemaker. He's making those wines himself, and it's an unusual vineyard because it's in the area that would normally be the valley floor, that would normally be benchlands. And then it rises up into the foothills that eventually become part of Mount Veeder. So it's both a valley floor vineyard and a hillside vineyard. And the hillsides sweep around so that you have south-facing hillside, you have east-facing hillside, and you have almost a north-facing hillside. And the Merlot vineyard is a very gentle slope on very well-established up-valley benchland. So benchland that's right at the base of the western hills. And then the Cabernet Franc comes from these heights that are much higher up. And so the valley floor vineyards, what's called bale clay loam, which is kind of the classic benchland soil with cobbles and gravel and so on. And then the upper reaches of this vineyard are what's called hambrite complex, which is basaltic rock. And as I've said before, the basaltic rock is that orange rock, orange because it's made of, it has a huge iron content, and the rock has incredible density. Great, great structure from out of those vineyards from Hambright Complex. Okay, that's delicious. I'm gonna have to have another sip before we move on to the next wine. I don't think I need my spit bucket anymore. There's a really kind of lovely licorice character that just goes through the whole wine. And the wine doesn't have any holes in it. It's perfectly round at every level. And this is a real characteristic of this vintage. As I said, we have very little tannin in the wines of this vintage. So the wines are incredibly soft, but incredibly lush too. I mean, the finish is just like velvet, but it's like the most layered wine that you can possibly imagine. It's very sexy. I mean, if you describe a wine as sexy, this is the one you're thinking of. It's all richness and softness. And who doesn't want rich and soft? So now I'm going to open the Cabernet Franc, BlackMail Cabernet Franc. Again, the same label. You can see it says Cabernet Franc on there. I do like this name. It's been kind of controversial, the name BlackMail, but I think it's kind of funny and a really good idea. So this is, again, a 4-barrel blend. So again, it's a shame to pour this one out, less than 100 cases. And Cabernet Franc based. And I'm going to repeat our stories about Cabernet Franc that we've learned. There's a little tongue full of that Merlot still there. So Cabernet Franc is a very old variety. So we're not clear as to when it made its appearance in history, but it's been around for a heck of a long time. And their vines were found in the Collegiate Church of Roncevaux, which is in Basque Country in France, right along the Spanish border, southwestern France. The Pyrenees are in Basque Country there, so right along that beautiful coast in that part of the world, Saint-Jean-de-Luz, Biarritz, those towns are part of that beautiful Basque Country, and then on to San Sebastian in Spain. But one of my favorite places, I'm a terrible surfer, and so that area has always attracted me because it's a great area to surf and beautiful beaches all along there. You don't really think of going to beautiful beaches in France and surfing, but you can surf in France without a wetsuit in summertime. So just so you know. So Cabernet Franc, it comes out of Basque Country. There's some proof of its existence back to 1050 with a varietal called Breton that is presumed to be Cabernet Franc. And Rabelais, who was from the Loire Valley, talks about Cabernet Franc-based wines in his Gargantua, his epic story of gluttony. So I have a theory about Cabernet Franc, which is that all of the Cabernet Franc vineyards are along what's called the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. And it's a famous pilgrimage site. It's a road to a famous pilgrimage site, Santiago de Compostela. And most of the people going on that site, going on that pilgrimage, would have walked the road. They would have carried vine cuttings from their world, or they would have got vine cuttings along the way and distributed them as they went. And everywhere along the French Camino de Santiago de Compostela, there are Cabernet Franc vines. So you go to the Loire, Saumur, you have Chinon, all of these famous towns that you see the Book of Hours from Saumur. All of these famous areas were big agricultural areas, big centers for nobility, big centers for religion. They all had Cabernet Franc. You go south, Saint-Emilion is on the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. You go to Bordeaux, Santiago de Compostela. You continue down to Basque country, you have the area of Oruligui that has Cabernet Franc, and into Navarra in Spain, and you still have Cabernet Franc. So it followed this religious pilgrimage, and that's a religion I could get behind. I am a devoted acolyte of Cabernet Franc and love it. It's a question that kind of came up. It says, not decanting, any particular stance on when to decant or not? And I think, I tried the first wine, the Merlot, and it really would have loved a decant. There's just a little bit of reduction there. It probably would have loved to be decanted maybe an hour in decanter before trying, just to open it up. And good, Christine, thank you for that question. It's a very good question. So let's get back to this Cabernet Franc. And then someone asked, Claire isn't taking the extra wine tonight? Question mark. Yeah, Claire, my wife. Yeah, she will, I'm sure, taste all of these wines, and probably the kids will taste them too. Hopefully, spitting out. Yeah. Okay. So Cabernet Franc. I mean, classic Cabernet Franc. Tobacco, cedar, blueberry, raspberry, violets. It can be a bit herbaceous. In this case, it's not herbaceous at all. It's very, very beautiful, and you really. The dominant aroma you get is of cedar and tobacco and blueberry. It's the triumvirate of Cabernet Franc for me. So we can't forget that Cabernet Franc is also the father of both Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon. So these three varieties are the three great varieties that make up the 5 contemporary Bordeaux varieties. So if we think about that, that's, if you look at those 3 varieties, you have 3 of the greatest varieties in the world of wine, and they're all related to this one Cabernet Franc. So Papa, we salute you, Cabernet Franc. So this wine it has a sweetness to it in the aroma. It's almost like it's brown sugar or molasses, and then real violety. Wow, it's all black fruits on the palate. Wonderful. Again, that wonderful touch of forest, cedar, lot of intense black fruit though, blackberry, black cherry, black currants, and just an abundance of them on the palate. Again, huge density. I mean, these wines are rich and dense. They're mouth coating, a lot of power there. Oh, that's absolutely delicious. Both of these wines have been fabulous. I'm gonna put those corks in so Claire can try them free of fruit flies later. beautiful sweetness. And the tannins are absolutely soft as they can possibly be. So this is from two different vineyards. And there's a little bit of Cabernet Franc, or there's a lot of Cabernet Franc in here, a little bit of Merlot, and a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon. So again, the Cabernet Franc and, well, some of the Cabernet Franc and the Merlot come from Scheldt Vineyard that we talked about earlier. And then there's some Cabernet Sauvignon from Stagecoach Vineyard, and this is that same hambrite, that basaltic rock that we talked about for the upper reaches of Scheldt that make these real dominant wines. And this is from a vineyard block in Stagecoach that's called M5. My wine under the Pott label, Her Majesty's Secret Service, comes out of this same vineyard. And it's just a powerhouse of a wine, a massive wine, rich and intensely dense. Cabernet Franc from Obscure block at Stagecoach, N6B, and the N blocks at Stagecoach, they're north-facing blocks. So they're very cool, they're very late ripening, and get a lot of wonderful blue fruit from those Cabernet Franc blocks. Okay, let's move on. Cabernet Sauvignon, BlackMail. It's awful to pour these things out, but we'll get around to them. And we'll see what we've got here in the Cabernet Sauvignon world. How are the bunnies? Is a question. My youngest daughter, Isolde, her 2 rabbits that are Netherland dwarves had babies a couple weeks ago, and they've been the absolute joy of our world. This one's got a lot of schmutz on the cork. So I'm going to make artwork with them. There it is, my grape cluster, made spontaneously. I will auction it off to the highest bidder. Okay, BlackMail Cabernet Sauvignon. Let's talk a little bit about Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon, I mean, we think about it. You know, one thing I want to mention about Cabernet Franc before we leave it, which is that there's a theory that the more closely related you are to wild vines, if you're a grapevine, the more closely you're related to your natural ancestors that were living in the forest in Europe at some point in time, the more you show your sense of terroir, and the more you show the site that you're from, essentially. And Cabernet Franc is one of those varieties. Pinot Noir is another one that's very old. It's been around for a long time, and it really shows where it's from. And there are only, in my opinion, there are only 4 types of soils in Napa Valley that are ideal for Cabernet Franc, and they're very few and far between. Again, Cabernet Sauvignon. So Cabernet Sauvignon is a natural cross between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. Haha, Whitey, what are you doing there? So you've got this white grape that comes in, and it's a natural cross. We assume it's a bird that created a cross, and it fell into a vineyard, and boom, this happened at about 1700. And this is just an aside, proved by the DNA research of my neighbor, Dr. Carol Meredith, and amazing genetics researcher, amazing person all around. They make great wine, Legier Meredith, but wonderful people. And she found out that this cross existed. So we're talking 1700. This arrives in Bordeaux. Probably someone sees this vine after a rainstorm, realizes that it survives the rain. Cabernet Sauvignon was so hardy that it's super tasty. They start propagating this vine all around. And it coincides with a historical moment in Bordeaux where Dutch drainage experts. I mean, who knows more about drainage than the Dutch? You know, they live underwater pretty much. Their whole country is underwater. So they need to know as much as they can about drainage. And so they bring their technology in the late 17th, early 18th century to Bordeaux, and they start draining all of these vineyards. And you can still see their work to this day. In fact, the separations between the vineyards of the Médoc are these little drainage ditches that the Dutch created, that created the vineyards of Bordeaux. So you really, you don't have as many vineyards before 1700 as you do after 1700. Very important moment in history, and a moment that changes the world. And coincidentally, you have this amazing grape that shows up at the same time. So creating all these wines. So Cabernet Sauvignon, kind of the classic characteristics of it. It can be very monolithic, very austere. It's a very tannic wine. It's a very long-lived wine. I've had 100-plus-year-old Cabernet Sauvignons that have been fabulous. And, you know, I mean, 75 years is nothing for a Cabernet Sauvignon. We had a 1929 and 28 Latour a couple of years ago, and they were perfect. I mean, drinking like they were young and youthful. I can't imagine what they were like as young wines. But Cabernet Sauvignon can go the distance. This is all black currants. I mean, it's just blackberry, blackcurrant, classic boysenberry. I mean, that's really bringing me back to Oregon. A little touch of nutmeg and clove. There's no, I mean, you know, kind of classic characteristic of Cabernet family wines are these pyrazine aromas, or that aroma of green pepper, and there's none of that here. It's so fruit forward. Again, very tobacco-y. That beautiful smell of cigar box. A little more tannin here, a little more age to happen here, but very soft tannins, very tight grain. They finish very soft. You have great length. Again, a little bit of black licorice, a little bit of blackberry in the finish, but very good length. This is a beautiful wine. I mean, I would say this probably has about 10 more years of life to it, easily. And whereas these other wines are just pure pleasure right now, this wine is a little bit more muscular, a little bigger, has some more time. A good one to put into the cellar as a collector wine. So again, we have Cab from a couple different vineyards. The Stagecoach Vineyard, that M5 block that we talked about earlier, that's that Hambrite soil, that basaltic soil, big wines. A little bit from Spring Mountain. This is from the Ballard Vineyard. We've talked about Ballard before, but Carol Ballard and Christina Ballard are the owners. Vineyard that I planted in 2001 for them, and I make a wine out of there called Caliho Manuk under my own label. Carol and Christina are both filmmakers. Carol's very well known. He's a very well-known filmmaker. He was the head of camera crew B in his first film credit. Got paid a flat fee of $1,500 for a little art film called Star Wars. Very important film after that he made was called The Black Stallion. Some of you may remember. But a great filmmaker, a great couple. They have a vineyard on the very top of Spring Mountain that produces crazy good cab. It's a combination of 3 different soils, Boomer, Aiken, and Forward soils. So all volcanic soils, some basalt, some rhyolite or tuft volcanic ash, and then a little bit of Cabernet Franc from Scheldt Vineyard in here. Just gonna get another sip before I go on to the last wine. Can't spit that out. It's good. I run into this problem at the end of these tastings. Okay, I'm pouring it out though. It's terrible. Okay, so the last wine's a little bit of a surprise and a little bit of an homage to the auction. Auction Napa Valley would have been happening next weekend, and it's a great event for us. It's a lot of fun to be able to show off this amazing valley, and it really, I have to say, the more this crazy pandemic goes on, the more I realize that I live in an absolute paradise. It's fun to show this place off. It's a 4-day celebration that has intimate vintner dinners where you go to the properties and have dinner with the owners and staff of the wineries. There's a barrel auction that highlights single barrels, single barrel wines. So each one of the wineries that participates has a barrel in the auction. You can buy a single case out of that barrel if you win it. You go around and you taste all the different wines in those single barrels from the vintage previous. And then it all culminates in the grand auction, which is just a big hoot. Last year we had Katy Perry playing at the auction singing, which was a blast. Love her. Being the father of 2 young girls, I had to get her autograph, which was only slightly embarrassing. And I knew all the words to the songs, which was even more embarrassing. Probably more embarrassing to my kids than to me. But anyway, the auction is put on by the Napa Valley Vintners, and it supports 25 local charities, and it's raised $200 million for those local charities since 1981. And it's probably, supports some of the great charities. For me, the Boys and Girls Club, all over. We have several Boys and Girls Clubs all over Napa Valley, and they're really great here because of the auction. Olay Health, which is a local clinic that's a free clinic, mainly focused on migrant workers, free health for migrant farm workers that we have many of here. The Rionda Senior Center, which my mother attends, where they do art classes, brain health, all sorts of wonderful things for seniors. So great thing. So this is one of those wines, and it's 75% Cab Franc, 20% Merlot, 5% Cabernet Sauvignon. And this is from the barrel auction. There's the actual big auction at the end of the auction Napa Valley, which are special lots and experiences, super fun. But those wines are generally wines that the wineries make, but these are individual wines that are made specifically for the auction, so they exist nowhere else. And this is, like I said, 75% Cabernet Franc, and this is from Scheldt again. Scheldt was a huge part of our wine program in 2015. Cabernet Franc from Hudson Vineyard, one of my favorite vineyards, owned by the charismatic Texan Lee Hudson. Carneros Vineyard, so very cool climate, right on the edge of where Cabernet Franc can ripen. And we actually have a parcel that was planted specifically for us of Cabernet Sauvignon there, which I find amazing in every vintage. But very cool climate and wonderfully aromatic Cabernet Franc from there. Cabernet Sauvignon, again, 5% from that Stagecoach M5 vineyard, and then 20% of the Merlot from the Scheldt. This is pretty. It's a little more earthy. There's a real black truffle nose there. Again, that cherry you get from the Merlot. Also the cedar and the tobacco from the Cabernet Franc. Mm. And again, that real tell for that 2015 vintage, you know, these big, compact, dense, not so tannic, very soft, very rich wines that just say 2015. Wonderful wine. I want to thank you. I've gone way over time as always, but I want to thank you guys for tuning in and for your great questions. Is this wine available for purchase? Christine, that's a good question. I don't know if it's available for purchase. I hope it is for your sake, but I imagine that my dear friend Fever will be able to tell you that. That might pop up here in a second. And then go online to blackbirdvineyards.com and you can find out. I think there may be some auction wines in there, but certainly these BlackMail wines are available for purchase. We may have some. Yeah, we may be able to make something happen, Christine, says the Fever. Okay, so contact the Fever, contact Blackbird Vineyards, and you'll be able to find that. I'm going to sign off. I love you all. Thanks for attending, and thanks for all your great questions. Take care. Bye.